In this dialogue, I had the opportunity to speak with John Baker. John was an early American disciple of Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche, one of the great Tibetan teachers in America, and in many ways, the teacher most responsible for bringing Tibetan Buddhism into popularity in the United States. John and I had a fantastic discussion that ranged from descriptions and stories from the early years of Trungpa's arrival through the process of discipleship. We spoke about the classic book, Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, and ended with some deep insights about the relationship with a teacher, the nature of the path, and even Trungpa's way of understanding the practice of meditation. I am sure that you will enjoy this. Thank you very much for listening.
What are we about today?
All right. Well, I wanted to talk to you about cutting through spiritual materialism, and I'm doing a meditation teacher training right now, and one of the books I'm having people read is Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, and so that was part of what inspired me to think that I could speak to you about it. I read it the first time probably 30 years ago or so, and it was one of a handful of books that had the biggest effect on me. So it was important at the initiation point of my journey. So it's one I've always held dear to heart. And later my path was more dominated by the Advaita Vedanta teachings of Ramana Maharshi.
I started with that.
Oh, really? Interesting. We sort of crossed paths.
Definitely. I mean, before I met Trungpa Rinpoche, I meditated for maybe a year and a half at the Ramana Maharshi ashram here in Manhattan on 6th Street East.
Okay.
And it was run by a retired UN person, devotee of Ramana Maharshi, named Bhagavat, Arunachala Bhagavat. He was a very sweet little guy.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I guess I would love to start by just asking you, well, I heard just now a little bit about your very beginnings, but I also know that you were a close disciple of Trungpa, and I just wondered if you could say a little bit about how you met Trungpa, how you got involved with him. How did that ball get rolling?
I was very unhappy as a boy, especially in prep school. My parents sent me to a private country day school where I experienced anti-Semitism and felt like a loner. And my junior year, a man came, do you know who William Sloane Coughlin was?
No.
No? He was the chaplain at Yale, and he led the first freedom rides down into the South. And he also was on TV with William F. Buckley. They had debates that have actually been put into a film recently, I think.
Oh, yes. I remember that now.
So anyhow, he came to my school and led a 3-day religious conference over the weekend, and it blew me away. It was asking all the big questions, is there a God? What's the meaning of life? What about death? And life after? All these things. And I just caught fire in it. And I went to that thing. And then the next year there was a follow-up conference in Buck Hills Falls, Pennsylvania. And my school sent me and one other fellow as delegates. And then when I went to college, I went to Yale, I was looking for that kind of inquiry. And I wanted to find the answers to these questions. And I just didn't find it. And I was very disappointed and sort of slogging through Chaucer and Biology 101 and that kind of thing. And after my sophomore year, I left. And I joined the Merchant Marine and became a sailor. And I shipped out for about a year and a half to South America and to Far East and a bit around the United States coastwise. And I was probably lucky that I might have just kept going and never gone back. But what happened was Vietnam was happening, and I called up my parents one day and found out that they were calling me up for the draft, and I hadn't shown, and for my physical, and the FBI was starting to look for me.
Mm-hmm.
So I quick zipped back up to Yale and talked to my dean, and he wrote a letter to the draft board, and I went back to college.
Mm.
And I went to graduate school, and I couldn't stay in graduate school because Nixon took away draft deferments for first-year grad students. I moved to New York and became a teacher in the New York City public school system, and that was very inspiring. And one day I was very lonely, and I was walking around in the village, and I saw this poster up, and it said, Baba Ramdas, paren, Dr. Richard Alpert, speaking on Ashtanga Yoga. And my brother had written me from the University of Pennsylvania that he was studying yoga by mail from an outfit in California. He was at Carnegie Tech, actually. And it was Paramahansa Yogananda's Self-Realization Fellowship. And that he was going to get enlightened by mail. And I didn't know what enlightenment was. I didn't know what yoga was. So I figured I'd go and listen to this guy speak, Ramdas. You know, I knew who he was, Richard Alpert, Larry, and I read their books, Politics of Ecstasy and, Psychedelic Experience. So I went and heard, and I was knocked out. I mean, Ramdas, he spins magic. He's delightful. Was. And so I began searching spiritually. And I kept trying all the venues and reading the books that he recommended. And there was a lot. I went and sat for a few weeks in a Benedictine monastery in Elmira, New York. I visited the Ramana Maharshi ashram in Zendo here in New York. Paisan Shimano was teaching in a Zendo. I went to that. And there was a Ramakrishna Society that I remember was really dark. That was a funny place. And I just tried everything. And nothing seemed to really make a lot of sense. The best thing was the Ramana Maharshi ashram, and I finally sort of stopped shopping and, just stayed there. And but then this fellow came to New York, Trungpa Rinpoche, and he was giving a talk, and a friend of mine suggested we go, and I went. And, I'm just making a long story short.
Sure.
And I went twice. The first time, Rinpoche hadn't gotten in, and his student, Kunga Dawa, Richard Arthur, wonderful Englishman, who just died, actually, became a good friend of mine. And he was speaking, and I was attracted. So when Trungpa Rinpoche came a few months later, he managed to get a visa. I went and heard him speak, and I just wasn't interested. He wasn't my kind of guy. He showed up in a suit and tie, and he had this blonde sitting next to him. They were sitting on chairs, and I'm sitting on the floor in full lotus, trying to impress the guru, I guess, and trying not to look up her mini skirt and her underwear. That was his wife. And so I wasn't going to follow up. And instead, a friend of mine and I were going to go to India and to kind of see if we could find a teacher the way Ramdas said. Something that would really knock us out, inspire us, make a deep connection. And I bought a ticket on a charter flight for August, sold the keys to my rent-controlled apartment, sold my car, and I was waiting, and my friend called me up from what was then called Tail of the Tiger. Now it's called Karme Choling. And he said, it's hot in New York, and this guy's giving teachings. Why don't you come up here and kill the time? And then we'll go. We were going to go together. So I did. I caught a bus. And I went there, and Trungpa Rinpoche wasn't lecturing yet. He was giving what he called interviews. So I thought, what the heck? And I signed up for an interview. And it took place in a little, office, tiny little room that he had that was an anteroom to his tiny bedroom that he shared with Diana. And we sat there, and I couldn't think of anything to say and didn't say anything. nothing happened. And finally he just said, well, he was sitting there smoking and looking out the window. And he said, well, maybe we ought to end. And I left. And then I thought, well, I wasted an opportunity. So I signed up again. And this time we met on the front porch, just the two of us. This is when he did it. And something opened in me, I think it was him that did it, and it was his openness and gentleness. And I just sort of poured out all my unhappiness to him. And then he said, he knew I meditated. I told him I'd been meditating for a while, quite a while. A couple of years, mostly with the Ramana Maharshi people. And so he said, let's meditate together. So I assumed a meditation posture, and I'm looking out across this meadow of weeds. Then used to be some kind of meadow, and there was a tractor coming across, and about a half a mile of meadow or something down to a stream. And basically, he gave me what in the tradition is called pointing out instruction. Or sometimes they call it, the teacher shows you the nature of your mind. And I had no idea that this was coming. I had no idea what it was. I didn't even know those words. I was clueless. But he blew me away. And I knew something deep and profound had happened to me. That I had seen something. And everything unfolded from there. That was kind of the turning point of my life.
And what year was that?
That was 1970, July.
1970. And so from there, you clearly you got involved because I believe you started working with him editing Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism because you were one of the two editors.
That came much later. I kept thinking I was going to India, and he kept saying, oh, you ought to stay around a little while. And finally I realized I wasn't going to India. There was no point, I'd found here what I was hoping to find there. And then he had been invited to Colorado by some people out there to teach at the university. And I asked him if I could go out there with him. That was towards the end of the summer. I just kept staying around. We had a whole summer together, and more and more contact with him, all kinds of wild, interesting things. He was such an interesting character. And so he said yes. So I went to Colorado with him. And we lived together for a year and a half, he and I and one other fellow that had asked the same thing, a guy named Marvin Casper, who was the co-editor.
Right.
Cutting Through. And we wound up renting a duplex, and Rinpoche and Diana and their baby, Tagi, and later Gesar, inhabited the downstairs. And Marvin and I had the upstairs. And I was his secretary, his driver, when she was away, I helped him bathe, cooked, and his student. And it kept unfolding, both personally between him and me, and then organizationally. We started a meditation center, and Marvin and I were the co-directors for the first 5 years. And then there was Cutting Through, and then the Myth of Freedom after that. And then we started Naropa. Marvin and I started Naropa. We went to him. We said, look, there are all these academics showing up, we got to start a school.
Right.
And he agreed. He loved it. He loved the idea. So we started Naropa. We hoped, we hoped maybe for that first summer we might get 500 people. 2,000 came. It was outrageous. It was just an explosion.
Wow.
Allen Ginsberg was Rinpoche's student by that time, and that's a whole set of stories. And he brought all his friends and started what he called the Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics, because Jack was dead.
That's right. So, as I said, you and Marvin were editing Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism. And for people who may be listening who aren't familiar, although so many people are, there may not be many, but this is really a modern classic. And I think I would be curious to hear your sense, because so many spiritual books have been written over the last 50 years, but so few of them have attained the kind of, classic status of this particular book. Now, of course, when you were writing it, you couldn't be certain that was going to happen. But what do you think it is about this book that makes it such an enduring, important classic? I mean, I just read it again over the past few months and felt like I was reading it. I couldn't believe how much I'd missed in the first few readings, or thought maybe somebody snuck in there and added some stuff. But it's such an enduring classic book.
I have the same experience. I've been reading it recently, and to help with some things that I'm teaching. Every time I pick the thing up, I feel like I've never seen it before. I think what happens is that we evolve. Our understanding of it evolves, and then you come back to it, and there's so much in it. But then you hear more. You hear more of the things that you didn't hear before. That's my suspicion. And yeah. And
so, how did it come about, this book? I know it was originally a series of lectures. What was it that inspired the Rinpoche to give a set of spiritual lectures on cutting through spiritual materialism, and then what inspired him to take those lectures and turn them into a book?
Well, I mean, he'd written, he had a book. He never wrote a book, but there was a book that was made out of his talks in England called Meditation in Action. It was published by Penguin. And that was the first, and also he worked on, he told the story of his life, and that was published in Born in Tibet, and that was in England. And when he got here, there was nothing that had been done. It was early, and we decided, let's do a book, relating here. Now, his style of teaching changed from England to the United States, and it had to do with the students who were coming. He felt that he was much more relaxed here, and that he could open up and be more generous with the students who were showing up here, because they were less likely to distort what he was going to say. He felt that suffering produces a lot of distortion, so he tightened up a lot in the cities, and he opened up a lot in Boulder. And because he said in the cities there's so much suffering that people take what you say and they want to use it, and then in doing that they're twisting it. And you have to be more careful about what you say. And in the cities he was much more terse, and he had been in England as well. And then he gave people were coming from the coast. Boulder was like a jumping off point for every commune you could think of. There were communes all over the place. And in fact, there was this one commune that came and became his students. They called themselves the Pygmies, because a bunch of them were short, and they called their commune the Pygmy Farm. And there's a book that one of the ex-Pygmies wrote recently called "Taming Untamable Beings" about that period. It's terrific. I love the way he starts it. He says, "If you can remember the '60s, you weren't there." They were doing so much acid. And they were wonderful people, but every commune had its own flavor. Very different one to the next. And then there were all the people who weren't in communes. They were just coming to Boulder. Boulder was full of hippies. It was also full of Seventh-day Adventists. When I first arrived in Boulder in 1970, you couldn't buy liquor within the city limits.
Right.
Because it was controlled by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So he gave his first seminar, and the students got together and they rented this house from a yoga instructor. And it had a garage which was her yoga studio, just a little split level, tract house with a little 2-car garage. And,
right.
And she had turned it into a yoga studio, and this group of students got together and they rented it, and he named it, from Rinpoche, he named it Anitya Bhavan, because he didn't think it was going to last. Anitya Bhavan literally means in Sanskrit, Anitya is impermanence and Bhavan is house. It was the house of impermanence, because it wasn't going to last, and it didn't. But he gave his first seminar there. And we took those talks, and maybe some others I can't even remember, and we edited them into the book, Cutting Through, Marvin and I. But I think the key thing is that, you know, neither Marvin nor I, especially I, knew anything about Buddhism. So when we took these talks, we went to him, and we went over every word of the editing with him. Every word in that book was gone over and changed, you know, a lot of it. Because he would talk to us, and we would then rewrite it, and we'd say, "Is this what you mean?" You know, and he would say, "Well, yeah, you know, it's fine, but what about, you know?" He says, "Let's talk about this," and then he would tweak it, and we went back and forth like that for months. And finally, what had happened was that, I'll just cut stuff out of this story, but. We decided to finish the book by going into a retreat together, the three of us. And we rented a house in California. He was going to do a speaking tour in California. And before that tour started, we had this house up on at the mouth of the Russian River in Jenner, California. It was a cabin, you know, out in the sands. You know? And it was just a cabin with a couple of bunk beds and a big bed that we gave to him, and Marvin and I slept in the bunk beds. And we stayed there for 3 weeks and finished Cutting Through. Going back and forth, you know, with him. Yeah, it was an amazing gift to me and Marvin.
Yeah, what an education. An unbelievable opportunity.
Completely. Immense.
Yeah. That's really, it's an incredible story. Now, getting into a little bit. Go ahead.
We're just going to back up one thing. Is that this? You got to understand this about Trungpa Rinpoche. When I talk about him pointing out instruction, you know, that makes it sound like it's a lesson.
Right.
It wasn't. It was the relationship that he opened up between him and us, or him and me. You know, between him and the student. And once that happens, every time you're with him, it's happening again and again. I mean, every time I walked into his presence, I felt like, you know, I felt like I was being X-rayed. You know, like he could just see straight through me. Right. And it was a challenge to be completely open and present
Beautiful.
with him.
Well, this is perfect, actually, because there were a few things about the book, reading it this time, as I said, that I noticed for the first time. And one of them, this wasn't where I was going to start, but I think it's perfect because you just got the ball rolling. But the chapter called The Guru, you know, this part I think I probably remember from before about how he thinks it's better to speak of a spiritual friend than a guru. But what I think I was really hearing this time differently than I have before is how he said the essence of the relationship between, you know, the spiritual friends or the student and the teacher is mutual communication. That's what it rests on. The ability to communicate honestly is the quality that one should be looking for, and that seems to be what you're saying in relationship to, you know, your relationship with the Rinpoche. That it was this communication and the openness that was the driver of what was being transmitted.
Absolutely. It was more than a driver. It was everything. It was like the air. I used to feel like when I walked into a room where Trungpa Rinpoche was, that somebody had just turned up the rheostat and the room got brighter. It's the you know, in Tantric Buddhism, the guru, the lama, the teacher, whatever you want to call it, becomes more and more important the higher up you go on the path.
Mm.
And it's because the teacher is the communicator of that kind of extraordinary openness of mind.
Right. And I was aware while I was reading the book this time that, it's easy for us to hear the word communication and think in terms of conversation and talking, but that, as you're just saying, the kind of mutual sharing that I think is implied by the word communication in this book far exceeds any kind of verbal communication.
Yes, I would agree.
Mm.
I would agree.
And, when I use, I just think the term spiritual materialism and the concept that Trungpa developed with it is so important for anyone on a spiritual path. And when I try to explain it to people who don't know it, the way I tend to talk about it, and I would just love to get your impression, your general impression of how I speak about it. But I generally say that, first of all, I say that spiritual materialism shouldn't be reduced to something like spiritual consumerism. It doesn't just mean acquiring a spiritual lifestyle, although it could include that. But at its more profound, in the more profound depths, what it's pointing to is any way in which we are turning spirituality or freedom or, however you want to denote the goal, any way in which we're turning it into something, an experience, a set of knowledge, anything that you could turn it into that would be something you could have, would be engaging in spiritual materialism, as opposed to giving up all ideas about, the way Trungpa speaks about it in this book, all of our dreams and fantasies, giving all of those up and so that something can happen that has nothing to do with you getting something.
I agree. Well said.
And one of the things that I read this time, that this one blew me away, because I really feel like I never even read this word in the book before. I have no recollection of it being in the book. But this time I realized it's all throughout the book, and I thought it was so profound, which is, he talks about following the path of disappointment. He speaks about the path of awakening being a path of disappointment, and I so deeply felt it in this reading that the path is an unending succession of recognizing that whatever you thought was the goal, or whatever you thought you had attained or would attain, those dreams keep getting dashed. You keep realizing it's not that. You keep living through the disappointment of giving up your fantasy of some awakening. And I just found it so refreshing to think about the path not in terms of what you're going to attain, but just in terms of this following the trail of disappointment until one, the way that I heard it was until you end up right here where you started. Before you developed all kinds of ideas about some place you thought you were going to get to. And I just thought it's poetically beautiful, it's spiritually potent, and it had a big effect on me in this reading.
Has a big effect on me too. I'm 74 years old. And, I was 25 when that book was done. 25, 6, something like that, 7. And, really, the end of life is, I'm finding an experience of loss. Loss of all kinds. And the path, for me, at this point, is coming to an accommodation, a grip, an understanding of mind with that. Bringing it to the path, bringing it to the path.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a huge opportunity, I know, and it's also an enormous challenge.
Yes, I can only imagine.
And it's the disappointment you're speaking of.
And I think I'm reading this book at a time when I feel there's a transition in my own spiritual life, and it involves a lot of letting go of ideas, I guess, ideas about what it meant to be on a spiritual path, what the goal of the spiritual path was. Not that I feel less inspired, because I definitely don't. I just feel like all of those, so many of my fantastical romantic ideas were just fantastic romantic ideas. And
that's great.
And the reality of, and this is where I guess I feel the disappointment, because on the one hand I feel the joy of just inhabiting reality the way it is, without adding, exciting stories to it. And I feel the way that brings you into contact with what's already miraculous. And at the same time, I feel the disappointment in the sense of loss of some kind of spiritual script that needs to be thrown in the trash.
Sounds right to me.
Mm-hmm. And so you said, you were 25 years old when you got started. You got involved with Rinpoche when you were 25, and it's now 50 years later. And you said that you are embracing the end, coming toward the end of life. How do you see your entire path? I mean, your life really, as you said, Rinpoche initiated you on a path that you've been on ever since. So, you're someone, I don't know you well. I know of you, and we have mutual friends. And I have a great deal of respect for everything I've heard about you, and just the fact that I know you've had such a life of dedication to the path. And I'm curious, at this point, looking at your own life, what would you say to younger seekers? Either not so young like myself or much younger than me, about the possibility that you were introduced to, and what it means to follow that path.
Well, there's some generalities that you can make, and then there's the fact that each one of us is so different. And we'll live through those general experiences in very unique ways. In terms of generalities, I feel I want people to find a genuine spiritual tradition, not a panacea, not full of promises, but one that actually deals, with you. And more than that you have to connect to a genuine lineage holder, someone who understands the heart of it and can communicate it to you, the student, in a way that is helpful. And, the whole teaching of spiritual materialism is all about the difference between true spirituality and, on the one hand, and self-aggrandizement on the other. Building yourself up in some way. And it's funny, when Trungpa Rinpoche was leaving Tibet, he said that one of his teachers handed him this book, and it was a book about spiritual materialism. And the teacher said, "You're going to need this where you're going." Isn't that amazingly prescient? And because when he came here, of course, we were, this was the 60s, 70s, and everybody was looking for answers and, willing to, change, become macrobiotic and organic foods and then yoga and, change yourself into a Hindu and, chant Hari Ram and, everybody wanted to put on all that clothing. And that's one of the main forms of spiritual materialism is, you want to change yourself into something else. Somebody else's description of what it means to be happy, holy, all that. And really it's a matter of finding the way in, as he said, of finding the reality of your own life and opening to that. And opening to not only inside, but outside, opening to the world and becoming more generous and open. And I feel like it's a never-ending challenge, a never-ending task for me. And that you become smaller and smaller, less and less significant. Yeah. I was going to tell you, one time he gave me instruction on how to be a meditation instructor, meditation teacher. And it didn't have to do with helping people with their posture or how to focus their mind on their breath or whatever, although that's also, a part of it. Instead, we were sitting outside at a bench, and he said, what it means to be a meditation instructor, I can't remember his words, but the gist of it is this, if you can do it. He said the teacher opens to the student. Now, you know what it's like when you encounter someone who's very open and accepting of you? You warm to them, you melt, you relax, you feel good, and you relax. And that's what happens with the student. The teacher opens to the student, and it lets the student feel that they can be who they are, that they can relax, they can be genuine, And so they open to the teacher.
Right.
And then the teacher opens more to the student. And then that encourages the student to open more as well. And it goes back and forth like this. And he called it by different names. He said it's diplomacy. It's dancing. It's making love. And then he said, and at some point, perhaps, the teacher realizes they have to stop because they've reached the limit of how far the student can go.
Right.
And you don't want to go further because then you're going to scare the student. You're going to become frightening. And that will scare them away, and that defeats the whole purpose of the exercise of the relationship. And that is the essence of the teacher-student relationship. That's what he felt, really felt it means to teach meditation. And he's not talking about meditation as like this act of training your mind. He's talking about meditation as being present, open, complete. Open. You know this. Because I've read enough about you. Complete, open awareness. Right. Absolutely. And it has the quality of love in it, It really
definitely. And this, I think, is what, I asked you earlier about his use of the word communication, but I think ultimately this is the act of communication he's talking about. And it resonates so deeply with me. And other things he writes in the book about because as you just said, meditation, and this certainly resonates deeply with me, that in the end, meditation is simply it's really just an act of total trust. So it's just a letting go of all defensiveness and just sitting vulnerably in truth. And I feel that if you think of meditation in that sense, then it makes complete sense that Rinpoche would say that teaching meditation is this process of opening, where the teacher opens, that allows the student to open, so that the student's entering into a deeper and deeper trust of who they are, of life, which is the essence of meditation. That's really beautiful, John. And that was one of the parts of the book that jumped out at me this time. The way that Trungpa spoke about that dance between the student and the teacher and the communication that was taking place.
That concludes this audio dialogue. Thank you so much for listening.